Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 13, The Parish and the Poor Law. These days we think of real power lying in the central Westminster government, whilst local government has relatively few powers. But in the Victorian era and before, there was no welfare state, no state education, no national health service, and most people did not pay tax to central government. The business of Parliament was far narrower than it is today. Much of its business was war, conquest and empire. The rest was skewed towards the interests of the wealthy, the landed gentry and the emerging capitalist class. On the other hand, those issues which touched more directly on ordinary people's lives were addressed locally, primarily at the parish level. The parish electorate in England and Wales was generally broad and inclusive. There was the potential for elections for a range of parish officers, including constables, highway surveyors and overseers of the poor. Of greatest importance was administering the poor law, upon which most of parish funds were expended. This involved parish assistance to widows or abandoned women with children, as well as help for the sick and elderly. These are the issues in which women would be most interested, rather than parliamentary issues. Appropriately, it would seem that women had long had the vote at parish level. Certainly some women had been allowed to vote in local elections since 1818. This right for unmarried women being authorised by the Vestries Act. Not only that, but women also held office within the parish, at least from early Victorian times and probably earlier. Although there were attempts to reform and codify these practices in the early 19th century, in reality, in many parishes, democracy was in the ascendant far earlier than it was at the parliamentary level. Women's close involvement in local government, even very early in the Victorian era, has been widely unappreciated. This has given rise to the false impression that women were disenfranchised from all forms of public influence. In truth, women's enfranchisement differed little from that of men at this local level, though both were subject to wealth, property ownership or being a ratepayer, etc. Moreover, modern historical scholarship is revealing the truth. The publicity blurb for the book Ladies Elect, Women in English Local Government 1865 to 1914 by Patricia Hollis reads as follows, slightly abridged. This is a pioneering study exploring the world of women who held office some 50 years before they had the parliamentary vote. It is based on the records of some 20 towns and 10 rural districts in England. 50 years before the suffragettes fought to have the parliamentary vote, women in England were able to elect and to be elected to local district councils, school boards and poor law boards. This pioneering study explores the world of those women who held office on behalf of other women, children, the old and the sick. Local government offered that conjunction of compulsory philanthropy, municipal housekeeping and local responsibility, which made it a sphere suitable for women. Direct evidence of women voting in the early Victorian era is rare, but this is because records of parish elections seldom survive, unlike parliamentary elections. However, occasionally poll books for parish elections surface in the archives. One example is discussed in The Political Worlds of Women, Gender and Politics in 19th Century Britain, 2013, by Sarah Richardson. This relates to St Chad's Parish in Lichfield in May 1843. The poll book can be found in the papers of the solicitors, who were the Conservative Party agents. It was probably used to canvass local opinion in between parliamentary elections. 30 women voters were listed in that parish, including one plural voter, Grace Brown, who had 4 votes because of her wealthy status. The reason that women were able to vote was due to the fact that many local franchises were based upon payment of poor rates, irrespective of the sex of the person paying those rates. This was effectively a household franchise, and single or widowed women who owned or rented eligible properties were able to exercise the vote. In other words, local voting rights were gender neutral, although the bias of property ownership by men resulted in a de facto bias in voting rights. The organisation and powers of local government had arisen from immemorial custom and incorporated elements of the common law, as well as combinations of bylaws and private and public parliamentary acts. It seems likely then that women had enjoyed local voting rights and the holding of local office even before the Victorian era, perhaps since as Anglo-Saxon times. Women's local enfranchisement continued to strengthen throughout the Victorian period. In 1869, single women ratepayers got the vote in municipal elections. From 1870, women could vote in elections to the new school boards and also hold office in that capacity. Women could also vote under the 1888 Local Government Act, and in 1894 they were allowed to sit on local councils. By 1900 there were something like 1,000 female poor law guardians. Emmeline Pankhurst was herself both a school board member and a poor law guardian. When Dr. Pankhurst, her husband, died in 1898, Emmeline Pankhurst resigned her unsalaried position on the Board of Guardians of the Poor Law and was, and I quote from her autobiography, almost immediately appointed to the salaried office of Registrar of Births and Deaths in Manchester. Clearly, she was rather well connected. Let us not forget that life was hard in those times. The stories that Mrs. Pankhurst relates from her experience both as a poor law guardian and as Registrar of Births and Deaths are undoubtedly true. Underage pregnancies were common, and the blame and stigma did often devolve unfairly on the girl literally left holding the baby, though shotgun marriages were even more common. It is worth emphasising the dramatic change which came about in the administering of poor relief just before the Victorian era with the 1835 Poor Law. This act was meant to simplify the maze of parish by parish relief schemes which had grown up, entwining the whole country like clinging ivy ever since Henry VIII closed the monasteries, and with them their alms for the poor. Things had got into a pretty mess by the 1830s. In 1835, Edward Gulson, who did some prying for the poor commissioners in the still ununionised parishes of Oxfordshire, reported that rate receivers lived better than rate payers. One woman even paid the parish to let her lodge in the poorhouse where paupers ate meat daily. A gang of fit men, paid by the parish to mend roads, played pitch and hustle with the parish's money and took paid leave to go bull baiting. One may doubt those anecdotes, whether they were truly representative of the majority of those on poor relief. There will always be those who resent public funding for those who are not self-supporting, and there will always be those who game the system and hence provide ammunition to the former. However, what is certain is that the 1834 Poor Law was intended to reduce its costs. The new system was both unified and rigid. At the top, it was run from London by paid commissioners. Locally, it was run by elected boards of guardians, often petty tradesmen with a vested interest in being stingy to the poor. Parishes were lumped together into unions the better to support the new brick workhouses, which, like jails, were meant to deter, not attract, to break, not protect. Only the utterly desperate and beaten would live in them. That was their point. I recall my wife's grandmother, who was born in 1894, still having a visceral fear of the workhouse, despite never having been under threat of entering one. This was the oppressive system which Mrs. Pankhurst helped administer, though its failings were in no way her fault. Indeed, she railed against them. One wonders, though, whether she knew how recent an innovation were the workhouses. In her book, Emmeline Pankhurst remarked, in the context of her experience as a poor law guardian, "When women have the vote, they will see that mothers can stay at home and care for their children. You men have made it impossible for these mothers to do that." Ironic, I think, in view of the fact that feminism has made it all but impossible for most mothers to do just that, and indeed exerts an ideological image of failure upon women who choose to be full-time, stay-at-home mothers.